Hello, BookTube. Well, against a great deal of advice, personal and medical, I haven't been feeling all that good recently, but against a great deal of advice, I went out this morning. I had an errand to run, and that errand brought me close to uh, a big mall in Boston, big indoor shopping mall, and in that mall is a Barnes and Noble bookstore, big retail bookstore. I actually worked at that bookstore for years and years. At the end of my time with Barnes and Noble, the superstore chain here in America, uh, and I figured, I haven't been to this Barnes and Noble since the pandemic. At first, back in March. Sorry, I'm being mauled by my little dog. My little dog is mauling me. Why are you mauling me? Why? Why? Why are you mauling me? Why? Why? uh, where was I? She won't bite me on camera. She wants you all to keep liking her. You can hear her. This is a very adenoidal dog. When she's attacking something, she's gasping for air. Uh, I stopped going to Barnes and Noble at the mall when the pandemic hit. First, Barnes and Noble closed completely. Then, after a little while, they opened their what they call their commuter cafe, their express cafe. They had a cafe that was relatively detached from the rest of the store. It had a couple of stands that used to have newspapers and a couple of magazines on it. The store moved a couple of best-selling books out there, but it mostly catered to people who were living in the hotels connected with the mall, or who were still working, business people who were still working. Uh, and I guess that was understandable. Barnes and Noble didn't want no money coming in from that spot at all. In fact, maybe there's some employment law as well that's involved. That if you're not having customers, then you are not a business anymore. But after a while, Massachusetts tamed the curve of its pandemic, and Barnes and Noble gradually reopened as the state loosened its restrictions. And I've known for a while now that the store is back open for business. Customers are expected to wear face masks. They're expected not to congregate near each other, of course, that sort of thing. But as far as going in and browsing, finding something that you want, buying it, and then leaving, you're perfectly free to do that now. And I've just been putting it off and putting it off. So today I finally went. And I was astonished with what I saw. Uh, just first of all, in the mall in general, the layout of the errand that I had to do meant that I was walking through the entire length of the mall before I got to the bookstore. The bookstore is all the way at the shank end of one aisle of the mall, and this is a huge, huge place, multi layers, tons and tons of indoor trees, shops left, right, and center. And the very first thing I noticed, unavoidable, is that the whole place was empty. I'd never seen it like that before. I'd been there when I worked retail. I'd been there in the middle of blizzard warnings when everyone was told at 3 in the afternoon, go home immediately. The subway might shut down. Go home. And I of course, in retail, you don't get told that. So I would work until 5, and then I would come out, and the mall would be largely deserted. But what I saw today is death to retail, because there was no one at all. Just vast expanses of empty space. I went to the bookstore, and the bookstore was a little bit better. There were people shopping. There were people at the registers buying. And I thought, well, as long as I'm here, I will try to replicate, the way I used to do this, where I browse around, look for things of interest, and I also had an item that was on hold waiting for me. So I wasn't just pure speculation. I knew there was something I was going to walk out with, but I thought I'd walk around and browse too. And I did, and I have some things that I want to show you. Although the books, I got 3 books. One of them was the thing that was waiting for me. I'll save that for last. But the first 2 are mass market paperbacks. I love getting mass market paperbacks, but this Barnes and Noble hasn't been getting a regular supply of them. During the worst of quarantine, they were shut down, so they weren't getting deliveries. There wasn't anybody to open them, even if they had been getting deliveries. So I am maybe a little bit out of practice. I'm not maybe. I am definitely a little out of practice. I got a science fiction novel, Empire of Silence, by Christopher Rocio. This is The Sun Eater, Book 1. A big, thick thing. I hadn't bought a big, thick science fiction novel in so long in mass market paperback that when I saw this, I got it, and it was only when I got it back here that I realized that it's not new. That it's from 2018. So it's possible that under a different cover, I would have remembered this cover, I think. Under a different cover, we might have seen this on this channel. I don't think so. This is DAW, and I don't get a lot of science fiction. Didn't get a lot of science fiction back in my salad days of getting readers' copies in the mail. So I might never have seen this before. I liked the description. I did exactly what normal bookstore customers do. I read the back. And it's about a man named Hadrian who rises from nothing, rises through gladiatorial combat and in a fairly sprawling galactic empire, and achieves the reputation of a monster because he detonates a sun that kills tons and tons, millions of humans, in addition, I think, to a bunch of marauding aliens, and hence the title of the thing, The Sun Eater, because that's sort of an unofficial name that he takes on. I'm looking forward to it. It feels a little bit strange for me to read something from 2018 when I could have requested it in 2018, but I don't think I ever knew this existed. And the next one is a romance novel, and it's even worse. Not that that's bad. I will read that, the Sun Eater, the Empire of Silence, and probably enjoy it. But this next one is Kathy Maxwell, and I just think she's fantastic. She wrote a romance novel. I have it on this bookcase here somewhere, but not within reach. She wrote a modern Regency romance called A Match Made in Bed that was memorably good. Just loved it. I just loved it. I have everything else that she's written and really liked it. And I saw this, Treasured Vows. And I didn't recognize it, so I added it to Empire of Silence and got both of them. Those were the mass market paperbacks that I got. And again, once I got back here, I took a look at it and realized that it was originally printed in 1996, obviously with a different cover. So a Google image search is going to find for me what this looked like originally, and I'll probably kick myself. I probably had it once upon a time. That is just so stereotypically bad customer to get two mass market paperbacks, neither one of which was cheap. This is $8 and this is $9. Neither one of which is cheap, but I got two mass market paperbacks without paying any attention to their fine print. That's just bad. And I attribute that to being out of practice. I just haven't done this much. That's all. I'll read both of these things, and I hope I'll enjoy both of them. But the next time I go to this Barnes & Noble or any new retail bookstore, I will pay much closer attention. I would have been helped if the store had had a lot more new release mass market paperback, stuff that I know I've never seen or heard of. If I'd had a lot of that to choose from, I might not have made two picks that don't work. Don't work in the sense of just going to a bookstore and being fooled by the new release table. Neither one of these things is a new release. But it happened. So I'll read them and hopefully I'll enjoy them. And then because I was there at this Barnes & Noble has a huge newsstand. One of the things that the new owner of Barnes & Noble in America, Barnes & Noble has become a private company now and is under sole ownership, and the new owner, who's the owner of Waterstones in the UK, has already dropped several hints that he doesn't particularly like having a huge newsstand in his bookstore. And that's a terrible shame if that goes away, because it's the only one in the city of Boston. It's the only one even remotely close to it in size. But I took advantage of it while it was there and wandered all around. It's like just 4 enormous bays of magazines in every description imaginable. And I had a reason. I had a reason for doing this because I have been going through severe withdrawal symptoms for Analog and Asimov, 2 square-bound science fiction periodicals of short stories that I just love and that stopped. I stopped being able to get the new issues back in March. And I read online that they stopped making new issues in March as well, when the first heavy imprint of this first wave of this pandemic shut everything down, so that even if Asimov's and Analog had still been made, I wasn't going to the bookstore, and the bookstore wasn't open. So suddenly in March, I had nothing coming in for new science fiction short stories, and I started reading through the backlog that I had built up of Asimov's and Analog. And I just recently ran out of those back issues. I just recently read all the way to the March-April issue of Analog and Asimov. So I read the last story of the last issue and was suddenly out of science fiction periodicals. So I went to the newsstand hoping that I would find one of those, and I didn't. The issues that were there were the ones from March. However, there is a third square-bound periodical. It's this, Fantasy and Science Fiction. Another square-bound periodical that I don't like quite as much. I don't often find as much truly just hair-raisingly great short fiction in this as I tend to do in Analog and Asimov. But this one's new. I never miss an issue either, so it wasn't that I was compromising completely. When I was looking, I saw that this issue was new, so I grabbed it. So I don't subscribe to any one of these three. And my rule with these square-bound periodicals is very simple. It's very draconian. I read them from front to back. I start every story with, I just clear the mind and start at each story. And the story has to keep me going. The minute I'm reading, a novel might be one thing, but a short story, the minute a science fiction or fantasy short story in one of these square-bound periodicals stops doing it for me, so that the typical thing that I do is flip pages ahead to see where the story ends, how much more of it there is. The minute I catch myself doing that, I drop that story and move on to the next one. Because a really good short story, any kind of short story, but for now we can talk about science fiction and fantasy, a really good example of that will captivate you. You won't in a million years dream of doing anything like that. You'll just be reading, hungrily reading. And I did that with this issue. I got past there's an editorial column at the beginning where the editor talks about the pandemic, of course, and how this issue is on the stands now, so maybe something is happening right. But then the very first story is by Rati Mehrotra. I don't know this author at all. Rati Mehrotra. This is her first story for fantasy and science fiction. And the story is called Knock Knock, Said the Ship. And the very first story in this collection, it had me like that, where I wasn't dreaming of waiting for it to end. I wasn't dreaming of being impatient. I was just consumed, completely consumed. So this made up for these, because this is great. And if this is showing up on newsstands, then I have to hope that Analog and Asimov will be too, because I haven't subscribed to any of these things yet. But while I was at the newsstand, I decided to browse around the other magazines, because I have let almost all of my magazine subscriptions lapse. Once upon a time, I had 30 subscriptions, and I've let almost all of them go, mainly because I got all of those magazines because I had a perfect place, a perfect ritual to read them. A little hole-in-the-wall Chinese food place that I would go to once a week with a stack of whatever I had to read that week. I would read it carefully. I'd annotate it in pen. I'd get the same food, talk to the owner. But the pandemic stopped that. And long before the pandemic stopped that, I had 2 sick, ailing dogs, and they stopped it too. There was no way that I could do that. Go and do errands, certainly, to recharge my own mental batteries, but go just to enjoy myself without them? No, I couldn't do that and that. So I don't do that anymore. For the first time in 50 years, I don't do that anymore. And so I noticed magazines coming in the mail that I either wasn't all that interested in because I couldn't sit down with them, or that I was letting pile up. So one by one, I let those subscriptions lapse. The TLS, National Geographic, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, yes, absolutely, of course. But most of the rest, no. Most of the rest, I just let go. And it's kind of strange to me. So when I was at this gigantic newsstand, I got some three magazines that I used to subscribe to. First one is Men's Journal. You might not think that I'd be at all interested in Men's Journal. It's a He-Man lad mag with hideously overpriced goods and services in it. Those big, boxy, stupid retro watches that tobacco addicts like to wear, and beard trimming items, and the latest in breathing tectonic shoes and whatnot. That sort of stuff's largely ridiculous to me. This is one of many magazines that used to be aimed at conspicuously overcompensated Wall Street a-hole drones, just giving them lots of ideas on how to spend the money that they have, that they make hand over fist for giving up 17 hours of their day every day. But Men's Journal has always been a little different to me, even in that category, because Men's Journal over the years, I've been reading Men's Journal since it started, and almost every issue has something in it, some piece of writing that was commissioned that's really good, that isn't He-Man-y, that isn't just a ridiculous testosterone virtue signaling or whatnot. I have to confess, this particular issue didn't really have that. I was hoping that it would, but the thing that I was hoping for ended up being a squib, just a page long. Another thing that I like these Times magazines for is tech reviews. They will often give you like a page or two or three of new stuff that, since you're making $35,000 a year a week, you can buy all this new stuff. And maybe if you're making $35,000 a week and you're never going to get to use it anyway because you're being worked 17 hours a day, maybe you will start to import a kind of sick status to how much money you're paying for this crap that you're never going to even unbox. Every once in a while, those recommendation pages will talk about new tech, the latest tablet, the latest reader, e-reader, the latest MacBook or laptop computer, and those I find fascinating, but this issue had precious little in that regard. You're going to be able to tell from the cover. The cover has Andy Samberg on it from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and you're going to be able to tell right away what I was hoping would be the great piece of prose. But In Search of Bigfoot turns out not to be. It was just 2 pages long. And it was all rehashed stuff. So it was interesting. It was entertaining in a way. I'll pull it out when I'm done with the issue. I'll pull it out and put it in. I'll fold it up and put it in a Bigfoot book. But it wasn't the life-changing experience that I was hoping for. And then the other 2 magazines that I got were far more staples. These are things that once upon a time, if you told me there'll come a day when you won't subscribe to either one of these, I'd have said no. No matter what else goes, these will stay. But they didn't. They went away. I encounter on Twitter and Instagram, I encounter links to virtually every article in virtually every issue every month. I get in my reading of these things, and I haven't really missed having the issues come in and just pile up. First is The Atlantic, which has a whole bunch of book review stuff in the middle. I'm sure that this will have plenty of content to entertain me. And the other one, God, it's a heresy of heresies, The New Yorker. One of the greatest magazines in the world. This is the July 6th and 13th issue, and I haven't even cracked it. Haven't even touched what might be in here. No idea. The story that I know is in here that I'm going to disagree with. There's who writes it? Jeffrey Toobin, who I run hot and cold on. But in this issue, he writes about why the Mueller investigation of Donald Trump failed, and the Mueller investigation did not fail. I've read it a couple of times. It's a searing indictment of a criminal president. It does everything that it was supposed to do, everything that's legally enjoined to do. So that might be an article that I disagree with Toobin about, but one way or another, The New Yorker has everything. It has culture and books and theater and movies and music and all sorts of things. I will I'm sure love this issue, and I wonder maybe this will entice me to resubscribe. Not The Atlantic, but maybe The New Yorker. Could be. And then those were the magazines, and then the last thing that I got at this Barnes & Noble was a book that I specifically ordered. I specifically ordered it to come into the store because I knew I wanted it. But, and this is going to sound a little mercenary, but I throw myself in the mercy of the court, I didn't want to pay full price for it. I get an employee discount at Barnes & Noble. It's a very generous employee discount. And I figured, you're not in any hurry, so why not just order this into the store and get it there? So I did. And I mentioned it on this channel before and elsewhere. This is from DC Comics. This is a new hardcover called Superboy, a celebration of 75 years. With that great cover there is the old Legion headquarters in the background. There's Superboy and his dog, Crypto. And this is, some of you might recognize this, the look, because DC has been doing these volumes for a number of its different characters. I don't know if this will give me, no, this is all Superboy all the time. Okay, it doesn't give me, the book doesn't give me a list of other volumes that they've done. I have a few of them. I have one for the Justice League, I have one for Aquaman, one for Superman, one for Batman. This is Superboy, character I've mentioned a number of times on this channel, who started out life in 1945 in More Fun Comics as just a teenage Superman. That these are the stories of Superman when he was a boy. So it turned out Superman's creators pitched the idea to the DC powers that be that before Superman wore the costume and was an adult fighting crime in Metropolis, he wore the costume and fought crime and other things in Smallville, in his Midwestern hometown, where he had to be home by curfew, where he was the adopted son of Ma and Pa Kent. Went to high school, was into all sorts of things that normal teenagers are into, but was also an all-powerful teenage super god. And Superboy back then took off. Superboy was a hit. Got his own book. Graduated from More Fun Comics to Adventure Comics to eventually his own comic, to his own regular comic, and was one of the only DC heroes to do that. I think the first one ever to get their own book after World War II. Enormously popular, in other words. And I love those original issues. Just love them. Issue after issue after issue, adventure after adventure. The issues back then in the late 1940s, early 1950s would often have 3 adventures in each issue. All sorts of things that happened to Superboy. Sometimes he would lose his memory. Sometimes he would become a juvenile delinquent. A lot of times, Smallville would play host to some sort of extraterrestrial visitor. And a lot of those visitors were sort of funhouse mirror versions of Superboy. So you'd be a teenage boy who would be either meek, he'd have a bunch of superpowers, but he'd be meek, not brave, or more likely, he'd be a lout, he'd be a bully. And for a while, he would seem to win over Superboy. There were rules, unwritten rules in those early 1940s and 50s adventures of Superman when he was a boy. There was kryptonite, but not that much of it. And the unwritten rules were, let's not have any violence. You can have gangsters. There are gangsters in almost every issue who wave around guns. But let's not have anybody punch Superboy. And let's do our best not to have him punch anybody else. And when these superpowered hooligans come to Metropolis, well, they can cause all sorts of trouble. They can carve a mountain into a funny or a disreputable shape. They can divert a river. They can outwit Superboy. But let's not have anybody fighting each other. Let's not have any blood or anything like that. And those issues, Superboy continued forever. Just forever. Had a huge run as a character. Very popular. He was sidelined in popularity by a backup feature in his own book. At one point in Adventure Comics, the writer decided to introduce, as just the gimmick of the issue, decided to introduce a group of teenagers from the future. Superpowered teenagers from the future who came back in time to have adventures with Superboy and to bring him forward in time to their era to have adventures in the future. The Legion of Superheroes. And the Legion of Superheroes became very popular all by itself. There were plenty of Legion fans in the mid-1950s writing letters to DC Comics saying, I know this might seem rotten, but we don't even need Superboy. We just want more of the Legion. And that continued. Superboy teamed up with the Legion teamed up with Superboy. That continued for a long time, and then DC Comics did a company-wide continuity reboot called Crisis on Infinite Earths. And one of the many damages that Crisis did to this vast ecosystem of imagination that so many writers and editors have put together over the decades, one of the damages that Crisis on Infinite Earths did was to say that Superman never put on a costume as a teenager. That he didn't have a superpowered dog when he was a teenager. He had a normal dog. And that he never put on a costume as a teenager. He put on the costume as Superman when he moved to Metropolis. And Legion fans immediately said, well, if that's true, then what happens to Superboy? We have all these issues. We've been reading this character literally our whole lives. And you're saying he never existed. DC didn't care because in the 80s cocaine was really cheap, or I don't know. I don't know what the reason was. It seemed like suicide to me. It was one of the most noticeable, one of the first and biggest decisions on the comic book industry's part to antagonize the very people who made it an industry in the first place. Those gestures have become far more common. They happen every day now. But once upon a time, Crisis on Infinite Earths looked weird to those of us who've been reading comics our whole lives. And in the wake of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the DC powers that be came up with another storyline where they kill off Superman, appear to kill off Superman, and 4 beings take his place, each claiming to uphold the mantle of Superman. And one of those beings is a boy with a bad attitude and a leather jacket and sunglasses who calls himself Superboy. So all of a sudden, DC had a Superboy again. This Superboy was a clone of Superman and did not have Kryptonian superpowers. He had a set of superpowers on his own, but not Superman powers. He wasn't Clark Kent when Clark Kent was a boy. And that Superboy caught on and had many different titles and long runs in each. And I enjoyed a lot of that, very much so. I was there right alongside. And part of me was wistful, buying Superboy #1 because it wasn't my Superboy. It was a different character with that title, but it went on, and there were lots and lots of that run, the clone Superboy, that I really enjoyed. And comic book continuities came and went. DC continued to revamp its continuity. And one of the things that they did that was more controversial than almost anything else was to sideline all of their characters and just recreate them from the ground up as a-holes. And fans didn't like it. Of course, they didn't like it. They kept buying comics, but they didn't like it. And eventually, DC Comics brought all of the standard versions of their characters back, including Superman. And it turned out that Superman and Lois Lane had been in an alternate reality the whole time, and that they had Lois Lane had become pregnant. And as they're reintroducing the real, quote-unquote, real Superman into their standard continuity, Lois Lane gives birth to a son, Jonathan. And suddenly, there's another Superboy. We watch Jonathan Kent grow up to be 8 or 9 years old and start to don a version of his father's costume and start to manifest Kryptonian powers. So all of a sudden, there's another Superboy. Called himself that, teamed up with his best friend Robin, who was the biological son of Batman. So the team up seemed absolutely inevitable. And some of those issues, we've seen them on this channel on Comic Book Wednesdays and Comic Book Fridays, some of those issues were wonderful. Just wonderful, the two boys having adventures together. So once I went into this book, DC has encountered a large amount of legal troubles when it comes to representations of Superboy who is Superman when he was a boy. That's why there hasn't really been. That's why you could have 7 very successful television years of a show called Smallville. But the #1 rule of Smallville famously was no tights, no flights. This is not Superboy. This is Clark Kent. You can put Tom Welling in the costume, but only once he's Superman. You can't have him be Superboy as a teenager in the American Midwest. And that has continued to be true. There is no Superboy TV show. There is no Superboy comic that is the adventures of Superman when he was a boy. But the product, the property, has continued. And so when I knew that this book was coming, celebrating Superboy's 75 years, I thought, well, you'll get those 3 Superboys. You'll get Clark Kent when he was a boy. You'll get the clone Superboy. And you'll get Jonathan Kent, Superman's son. And you do get all of these in this. This is a wonderfully, wonderfully assembled volume with everything that you would want it to have. Everything. It has Superboy's first appearance. It has the Legion's first appearance in Superboy. It has Krypto's first appearance, the Superdog. It has the first appearance of Mon-El, a character who, for a while in the issue when he appears, I remember it like it was yesterday reading that issue. For a while in the issue in which he appears, it seems like he might be Superboy's brother. That his father had sent from Krypton separate from himself. Turns out that's not true, but it doesn't stop him from taking the name Mon-El from the House of L, even though he's not from the House of L. And also later Legion issues are in here, including a very wistful issue in which the Legion's resident telepath, Saturn Girl, mentally condition Superboy so that when he travels back in time to the past, he will forget the Legion. I remember that issue like it was yesterday too. It also caused a lump in the throat. And it's just fantastic that this hardcover has all of those landmark issues. Has the issue where we find out that Superboy and a teenage Lex Luthor knew each other in Smallville, and that it was in Smallville that Lex Luthor lost his hair and gained his lifelong hatred for the Big Red S. And I knew that this issue would also have that this anthology would also have the clone Superboy, and it does. It has his first issue and a couple of other issues, particularly one where he encounters his so-called Kryptonian heritage and gets a Kryptonian name, Con-El, even though he also is not technically of the House of El. And then the collection moves on to Jonathan Kent, including that issue that I showed you where the two boys are having adventures and also fighting each other until their stern fathers intervene. That issue is reprinted in here, and a couple of others as well, and that is just wonderful. That is a wonderful era for an iteration of Superboy. Going into this hardcover, I was expecting all of that, but I had totally forgotten Superboy Prime. There was, for a little while there, in the shadow of Crisis on Infinite Earths, there was Superman goes to an alternate dimension, an alternate Earth called Earth Prime, and Earth Prime is our Earth. It's normal reality, no superheroes, and all the superheroes are in comic books. As Elliot Maggin is the author of the issue, and as he puts it in the issue where Superman goes to that world, this is a world where Metropolis doesn't exist, where New York covers the ground that Gotham covers, that Star City covers the ground that Boston, and that, as Elliot Maggin puts it, the last hero was Bobby Kennedy, and I am a work of fiction. That's what Superman is thinking to himself. And in this world, he meets a young man named Clark Kent, who has been getting ribbed his whole life because his friends notice that he has a superhero's name, but nobody in this world has superpowers. But it turns out he does have superpowers. It turns out he is Kryptonian. I'd completely forgotten about Superboy Prime, and it's a very touching introduction. I wonder if I can quickly zero in on the. There's a panel where he and Superman basically cavort together. Yeah. Where Superman is teaching him the ins and outs of being a godlike super being. All Kurt Swan artwork, just fantastic. But he goes on from there, Superboy Prime goes on from there to become a hilariously overpowered villain. and a couple of that turn is in here as well. So this is literally every Superboy. This is well-trod ground for me. There are a couple of those Con-El issues I don't know backwards and forwards, but all the rest of this I absolutely do. The thrill here is to have it in one volume. The thrill is that this is a kaleidoscope of the arc of an entire character in its history. So I was very happy to get this at half off. So that sounds fantastic. And that was my trip to the bookstore. I got Superboy, a celebration of 75 years. I got two novels that aren't new. One from 2018, one from 1996. Science fiction and romance. I haven't read either one of them. That's the key. So I'll read them, see if I enjoy them. And a batch of magazines. I got Men's Journal. I got it for Bigfoot. I admit, I got it for Bigfoot. I got The Atlantic and The New Yorker, two previous staples of my magazine reading life. And also Fantasy and Science Fiction, the new issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Now I'm just living for the new issue of Analog and Asimov's. I'm just living to find out that they will be at that Barnes & Noble at some point. But they're not there yet. So that was my trip to the bookstore. Sorry this took so long. I'm going to wrap this up and check what was ringing the doorbell. But I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.